Welcome everybody. It's great to have you on board here. So we are finishing up chapter 6, social and emotional development in infancy. We ended last time talking about attachment, but we were only introduced to this concept. Now we're going to actually finish talking about attachment, and it's going to take up a bulk of today actually. So let's first go back and think about those instances of maladaptive social behavior we talked about last week. So for example, Harlow's monkeys, the substitute mothers, they couldn't provide the baby monkeys with social and emotional interactions. And long-term effects of the monkeys was that they grew to be indifferent or abusive toward other monkeys. Also, thinking about Bowlby's observations of orphans that were separated from parents, they exhibited severe detachment or indifference toward others. So we kind of see some parallels of those impacts of not having, that attachment and being separated from caregivers. So this poses the question, how do early interactions and relationships with caregivers impact later development? So we'll talk about Mary Ainsworth. Mary Ainsworth created the strange situation procedure, and this is assessing different patterns of children's attachment to mothers. So the method here is that mothers are in a room with the baby playing. Eventually, a stranger joins, kind of sits nearby, maybe introduces himself to the baby. Then the mother leaves the room and comes back later. So that's the general procedure. The purpose here is to observe, how do infants use their mother as a secure base to explore? How do they respond to separation from the mother and the reuniting of the mother? And how do they respond to the stranger? So different patterns of reactions would reflect different qualities of the attachment relationship. So the results prompted researchers to categorize infants into different types of attachment patterns or styles. So the first one is secure attachment, and this accounts for a majority of the children, about 65%. So these children in the strange situation procedure, they felt they felt free to explore when the mom was there. They cried and got upset when the mom left, and they couldn't be consoled by the stranger. When the mom returned, the child climbs to them for hugs and consolation. They calm down pretty quickly, and then they go back to playing. No, everything seems to be fine. Next, we have insecure avoidant, which accounts for about 23% of children. So this attachment style, these children in the strange situation didn't really care where the mother was sitting while playing. They may or may not cry when the mom leaves, and if they do cry, the stranger can calm them down. And when the mom returns, the child doesn't really react. Next, we have insecure resistant. So this accounts for about 12% of children. This is when, or what happened here is the child stays very close to the mother, doesn't really explore the environment, the strange environment, and they're extremely upset when the mom leaves. And they continue being upset and crying when the mom returns. It's harder to console them. It's harder for them to bounce back from this stress. And then lastly, insecure, disorganized attachment. There's no consistent pattern here of dealing with the stress of the strange situation. They don't really fall into a single pattern of behaviors like these other three. There's a lot of inconsistency and kind of all over the place. So that leads us to, what are some possible, I shouldn't have put causes, but influences of these different attachments. So one big area that's looked at is parental behaviors and parenting practices. So for securely attached infants, this is linked to parents being sensitive to the child's needs, being more involved with the child, having appropriate responsiveness and emotional synchrony with the child. In the strange situation, going back to that, the securely attached child can explore the environment when the mother was in the room, so they felt safe to explore while she was there. They were upset when the mother left, and they couldn't be consoled by the stranger, which indicates they have an exclusive attachment to this mother. And they were able to be soothed when the mother returned. So the child feels attached to the caregiver. They trust that they will respond to their needs and come back when they leave. And essentially, there's a healthy balance between being attached to a caregiver and feeling safe to explore the world. Next, insecure avoidant attachment. So this is linked to parents ignoring the child's emotional needs or not reacting to their signals, kind of a hands-off approach. And there could be a number of reasons this is occurring. We don't want to villainize parents. Maybe they're overwhelmed or have some sort of, mental health issue going on. That's a number of reasons, but in a strange situation, going back to that, the insecure avoidant child didn't really care when the mother left or returned. They seemed to be kind of dissociated and perhaps a little indifferent. So the idea here is that they stop expecting any kind of response from caregivers. And next, insecure resistance. So this attachment style is linked to parents being more on the anxious side or more chaotic in their attempts to calm the child. They're kind of inconsistent. Maybe sometimes they're very anxious and as a result of their anxiety, they're, scolding the child, whatever it is. And then other times they're very loving and understanding. So the child is a little confused. As we saw in the strange situation, the insecure resistant child is pretty anxious themselves and could even be described as kind of clingy, right? They don't really know what response to expect, and they're a little confused about the relationship with their caregiver. So they seem to kind of develop this fear of abandonment or rejection. Lastly, we have insecure disorganized. So here, this is linked to parents that are unreliable in meeting the child's needs. A little bit like the last attachment style, but here goes a little further, even into unreliable in meeting physical needs, like those basic needs. And this style also tends to include the element of perceived fear. So caregivers become a source of fear. And this is often due to abuse or maltreatment, or even witnessing a traumatic event involving the caregiver. So that kind of leaves the child not knowing what to expect and not knowing whether their physical and emotional needs will be met. So the bottom line here is that the insecure attachment styles usually stem from a child's needs not being fulfilled in some way or another. Now, let's also talk about some other possible influences. So, child characteristics. There has been a small association between attachment styles and temperament. Could it be the temperament itself? Maybe there's something biologically wired or inherent to that temperament that impacts attachment style? Or could it be how the child's temperament interacts with the parent and their caregiving? For example, going back to temperament, if we have a child that's more on the feisty side, they have that feistier temperament, it might, if we're being honest, it probably requires a little more energy on the parent's end. And they might be more in survival mode and might result in less sensitivity to the needs and less responsiveness. It's not necessarily malicious or intentional. It's just a result of the child's natural temperament and the energy that it might involve or the needs the child might have, right? So no one's really to blame here. It's just, going back to that natural temperament, how it interacts with the parent. We could also think of family influences as influencing attachment styles. So things like parental stress, economic status, marital discord, these could all potentially impact the attachment patterns. And lastly, cultural influences. So attachment is culture specific. Anything really is culture specific, but attachment can be defined differently and occur differently across cultures. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. But I just want to end by saying we're not here to judge parents or their parenting practices. There's a handful of reasons why parenting behaviors might be occurring, right? Maybe it's due to mental health. Maybe the mom is experiencing postpartum depression, which is very common. Maybe there's a lack of resources available to the family. Maybe they're very overwhelmed as a new parent. So there's so many reasons. that can explain behaviors. And also this research that I've shared may not be representative of all cultures, as I just said, which we will talk about later, how this strange situation is a little biased in a few ways, and we'll talk about that later, but it may not be representative of all cultures. So we're just looking at some associations here, but it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. Also, I just want to say this class by nature may have some of us reflecting on our own upbringings, and that can potentially come along with, um, you know, being a little triggering for some folks. And I realize that sharing these types of things, sharing all this research of implications of possible positive and negative outcomes, it can feel a little dehumanizing sometimes. I get that. I just want to say that even if there are maladaptive outcomes that we're sharing, there can always be remedy, and there's a lot of resilience in children and adults. So, in summary, we don't want to first villainize anyone, particularly parents, and we also don't want to paint anyone as, hopeless or lesser than or any of those things. So, I just wanted you to know I do acknowledge these things. I want to be sensitive to everyone here. But thank you for joining along. That just about covers this part of attachment. And next, we'll talk about some implications as well as cultural contexts. So thank you for joining, everyone, and I'll see you in that next section.